to work where the hip hop culture is concerned. I blazed the trail. Yeah.
Everybody is due a chance. You know what I mean? I really feel that way because I feel like if some people know better, they'll do better. And a lot of people do dumb shit because they don't know no other way.
Right.
You know what I mean? They don't know better. So I feel like, you know, they do that chance. You know, I even appreciate having that chance for myself, beginning with me. You know what I mean? Because, you know, a lot of shit I wouldn't have done if I would have known better. So, you know, with that combination of wanting that for myself, wanting that for my loved ones, then it's only right to like extend that invitation.
They didn't leak it by accident. They didn't mistakenly press upload. This was intentional, calculated, and aimed straight at one of the most feared names in hip-hop history. A 40-second clip shouldn't be enough to shake an entire city's power structure, but this one did. Because it didn't just show a man, it showed access. It showed proximity. It showed that the so-called untouchable family in Houston might not be untouchable anymore. And that's where the tension explodes. J. Prince built an empire on one word: respect. Not the kind you ask for, the kind people fear to deny you. For decades, that reputation protected artists, controlled streets, and shaped the entire Southern rap economy. People didn't move against that name. They moved around it. But now, someone didn't just move around it, they stepped directly into the frame and hit record. No leaks. No rumors. No whispers. Evidence. And once that footage hit the internet, the conversation shifted instantly from what happened to something much darker. Who felt bold enough to do this? And what happens next? Because in this world, moments like this don't fade quietly. They escalate. Every second of that clip becomes a statement. Every replay becomes fuel. And every reaction builds pressure on a situation already sitting on the edge. What makes this even more dangerous is what it represents. Not just a person being filmed, but a message being sent. We can reach you now. And when power like J. Prince's gets questioned publicly, even for a moment, it doesn't just create drama. It creates uncertainty. And uncertainty in this world is the one thing nobody can control. So now the real story begins not with the footage itself, but with what it has triggered behind the scenes. Because this isn't just about a video anymore. It's about a line that may have just been crossed, and whether anyone is still afraid of what happens next. They didn't just upload a video. They released a statement. And in the world of hip-hop power structures, statements like this are never casual. They are calculated signals sent to the highest level of influence, meant to be seen, replayed, and interpreted. Because when a name like J. Prince is involved, nothing exists in isolation. Every action becomes layered with history, reputation, and consequences that stretch far beyond the screen. For years, Houston's rap ecosystem has operated under an unspoken rulebook. Not written anywhere, not officially enforced, but understood by everyone who ever tried to move through it. Certain names carry weight that cannot be ignored. And at the very top of that hierarchy sits J. Prince, a figure whose influence was built not just through music, but through decades of business decisions, alliances, and a reputation that made people think twice before crossing a line. But now that rulebook is being tested in real time. The footage that surfaced didn't just show a moment, it disrupted a belief system. It challenged the long-standing idea that proximity to power guarantees protection from exposure. Because in that clip, the most important detail wasn't what was happening, it was where it was happening. A public setting. Visible space. No secrecy. No isolation. Which means whoever recorded it wasn't hiding. They were confident enough to be seen while watching. That alone shifts the entire meaning of the situation. In environments like this, confidence is rarely random. It usually signals backing, either real or perceived. And perception alone is often enough to trigger responses across entire networks of people who understand how quickly narratives can turn into real-world pressure. What makes this moment even more sensitive is the history attached to the name at the center of it. J. Prince didn't become a dominant figure through visibility alone. His influence was built in layers, starting from street-level respect in Houston, expanding into music through Rap-A-Lot Records, and eventually growing into a hybrid position where business, culture, and street credibility overlapped. That combination created something rare in hip-hop, a figure who could influence both the industry and the environment surrounding it. And when someone operates at that intersection, their family becomes part of the structure, whether they want it or not. That's why this footage matters beyond just one individual, because it touches the legacy layer. J. Prince Jr., who has grown up within that environment, has always existed under dual pressure: access and expectation. Access to opportunities most people never see, and expectation to uphold a reputation that was built long before him. In public perception, that kind of position is often misunderstood. People assume it means complete protection, but in reality, it also means constant visibility. Every action is magnified. Every appearance is analyzed. Every moment can be turned into narrative fuel. And that's exactly what's happening now. The footage spreads quickly, not because of what it shows visually alone, but because of what it represents symbolically. It introduces doubt into a space that traditionally runs on certainty. And in environments like hip-hop power circles, doubt is more disruptive than confrontation. Because confrontation can be handled directly. Doubt spreads. And once it spreads, it starts influencing how people move behind the scenes. In Houston specifically, where relationships between artists, executives, promoters, and street figures often overlap, perception is currency. If people begin to question whether boundaries still hold the same weight they once did, behavior begins to shift. Not immediately, not publicly, but quietly. People start reassessing associations. Conversations become more cautious. Decisions become more calculated. And in some cases, distance begins to form where closeness used to exist. That's how structural influence begins to crack, not through one big event, but through small recalibrations across multiple levels. And that is where the situation becomes far more significant than a viral clip. Because it is no longer just about the footage itself. It's about what people believe it means. Now, there's another layer that cannot be ignored: intent. The fact that the footage was shared publicly, rather than leaked anonymously, changes the entire psychological reading of the situation. A leak suggests chaos. A deliberate post suggests message. And messages imply audience. Which raises the question everyone is thinking but no one is saying directly: who was it meant for? In environments like this, messages are rarely universal. They are often directed, either at individuals, networks, or reputations. And when the target is someone with established influence, the message becomes even more sensitive because it forces interpretation at every level. Supporters interpret it one way. Opponents interpret it another. Neutral observers speculate. And insiders begin calculating implications. Meanwhile, the silence from the central figure becomes just as important as the footage itself. No immediate public response. No visible reaction. No direct acknowledgement. And in these types of situations, silence is never empty. It is read as strategy. Some interpret it as restraint. Others interpret it as preparation. And others interpret it as uncertainty. But regardless of interpretation, silence always adds tension because it leaves space for narrative expansion. And in that space, speculation grows. Online discussions begin dissecting not just the clip, but the entire ecosystem around it. People revisit past stories, past conflicts, past moments where authority was asserted or challenged. Everything gets pulled back into the conversation and reevaluated under a new lens. That's how legacy gets tested, not in real-time confrontation, but in retrospective scrutiny. Every past decision becomes relevant again. Every past conflict becomes reference material. Every past resolution is reinterpreted based on current perception. And that is where reputational pressure begins to build. Because once a narrative shifts, it rarely returns to its original shape. At the same time, within Houston's cultural environment, there is another force at play: awareness of consequences. People in these spaces understand that actions have ripple effects. Even symbolic actions. Especially symbolic actions. Which is why moments like this don't just generate conversation, they generate caution. People start thinking not just about what happened, but about what could happen next. And that anticipation creates a psychological atmosphere that influences behavior even before any direct response is made. This is where the situation enters its most sensitive phase. Not escalation, not resolution, but anticipation. Because everyone is now waiting to see whether this remains a symbolic challenge or becomes something more direct, more personal, and more irreversible. And in environments where reputation is everything, anticipation is often the most dangerous stage of all. Now the silence is no longer just silence. It has turned into pressure. Because when a situation like this lingers without an immediate public response, it doesn't settle, it compounds. Every hour that passes without clarity allows interpretation to grow, and in environments like Houston's hip-hop ecosystem, interpretation is rarely neutral. It becomes narrative, and narrative becomes momentum. Behind the scenes, that momentum is already shifting conversations. People who normally wouldn't speak on anything connected to this situation are suddenly paying attention. Not because they want involvement, but because in spaces shaped by influence and reputation, even indirect proximity can become relevant depending on how things unfold. And that's the part outsiders often misunderstand. This isn't just about one video. It's about what the video activates. It activates memory, past conflicts, past alliances, past moments where boundaries were tested. It activates awareness. Who is connected to whom? Who benefits from silence? Who benefits from escalation? And most importantly, it activates positioning, because once something like this becomes public, everyone around it is forced to decide where they stand, even if they never wanted to. In Houston specifically, that decision-making process carries weight. This is a city where relationships are not just social, they are structural. Business overlaps with culture. Culture overlaps with reputation. And reputation overlaps with protection networks that have been built over decades. So when something disrupts that balance, even slightly, the ripple effect is immediate. Now people aren't just talking about the footage itself anymore. They're talking about access. They're talking about confidence. They're talking about whether boundaries that were assumed to be intact still function the same way they once did. And once that kind of questioning begins, it spreads beyond the original context. Because now the conversation is no longer limited to one family or one individual. It becomes about the system around them. Within that system, silence from leadership figures is interpreted in multiple ways. Some see it as restraint, choosing not to feed noise. Others see it as calculation, waiting for the right moment to respond. And others interpret it as something more strategic, observing reactions before deciding direction. But regardless of interpretation, one fact remains consistent: silence increases pressure on everyone else. Because without a clear signal from the top, the environment fills the gap with speculation. And speculation is rarely stable. Meanwhile, the footage itself continues circulating, gaining layers of meaning with each discussion. What started as a 40-second clip is now being analyzed frame by frame, not for what is shown, but for what it implies. Body language is being studied. Setting is being discussed. Timing is being questioned. Even the act of recording itself is being interpreted as a message rather than just documentation. Because in today's digital environment, nothing is neutral anymore. Everything is intentional until proven otherwise. And that belief changes how people respond to it. Now, within the orbit of J. Prince's influence, the response is not public, but it is active. In environments like this, responses do not always appear as statements. Sometimes they appear as conversations. Sometimes as advisories. Sometimes as quiet recalibration of how people move, speak, and engage. Because influence structures don't operate on reaction alone, they operate on adjustment. And adjustment begins internally long before it becomes visible externally. At the same time, outside observers begin doing what they always do in moments like this: reconstructing identity through past narratives. Old interviews resurface. Previous disputes are re-examined. Historical moments of conflict and resolution are pulled back into relevance. The goal is no longer just to understand the present, it is to predict the future. And prediction becomes the dominant form of engagement. What will happen next? Who will respond first? Will this escalate publicly or remain behind closed doors? These questions circulate without answers, but they shape perception regardless. Because uncertainty is not passive, it is active. It influences tone, it influences discussion, and it influences expectation. And expectation, once established, begins to pressure everyone involved in different ways. For those close to the situation, that pressure is more direct. Conversations become more careful. Communication becomes more measured. Even casual interactions begin to carry awareness of how easily small moments can be amplified into larger narratives. For those outside the situation but within the culture, the pressure is observational. They're watching not just what happens, but how it happens. Because outcomes in moments like this often redefine boundaries for everyone else watching. And that is where the real significance lies. Not in the footage alone, but in the shift it causes in behavior. Now, one of the most important dynamics emerging from this situation is perception of vulnerability. In any system built on reputation, even the suggestion of exposure changes how people interpret strength. Not because strength disappears, but because perception recalibrates. And once recalibration begins, it affects trust. Not necessarily loyalty, but trust in predictability. Because systems like this rely heavily on predictability. People need to believe they understand the consequences of actions. When that understanding is disrupted, even slightly, behavior adjusts. And adjustments compound. That is how structural influence evolves or erodes. At the same time, there is another layer unfolding that is less visible but equally important, the audience effect. Because this situation is not happening in isolation. It is happening in a digital environment where every development is consumed, interpreted, and redistributed in real time. That means every reaction becomes part of the situation itself. Every comment adds pressure. Every analysis adds framing. Every share expands reach. So even without direct involvement, the audience becomes an active participant in shaping the trajectory of the narrative. And that creates a feedback loop. The more attention it receives, the more significance it gains. The more significance it gains, the more people feel compelled to interpret it. And the more it is interpreted, the less control any single party has over its meaning. That loss of control is what makes moments like this unpredictable. Because once narrative control fragments, outcomes are no longer determined by intention alone, they are influenced by perception at scale. Now the situation is approaching a critical psychological threshold. Not because anything new has been confirmed publicly, but because anticipation has reached saturation. People are no longer waiting passively. They're expecting resolution, response, or escalation. And when expectation reaches that point, even small developments can trigger disproportionate reactions. This is where environments like this become unstable. Not through action, but through readiness for action. And in that readiness, tension peaks. Because everyone involved, directly or indirectly, is now aware that the situation has moved beyond a single incident. It has become a test of influence, perception, and response timing. And in systems built on reputation, timing is everything. The next move, whatever it is from whoever it comes, will not just determine the direction of this situation. It will determine how similar situations are interpreted going forward. And that is why everyone is watching closely. Because at this point, it's no longer just about what happened. It's about what it means and who gets to define that meaning. At this point, the situation is no longer just circulating online. It is settling into something deeper. A narrative is forming. And once a narrative stabilizes in a space like this, it becomes harder to redirect than the original event itself. Because people stop reacting to what actually happened and start reacting to what they believe it represents. That is where things shift from moment to meaning. And meaning, in this case, is heavy. The footage is still being replayed, still being analyzed, still being interpreted through different lenses depending on who is watching. But underneath all of that, one idea keeps resurfacing across conversations. Boundaries have been tested in a way that cannot be ignored. Not because of violence, not because of confrontation, but because of visibility. In environments built on reputation and respect, visibility of proximity is often more impactful than direct action. because it signals access. And access, once demonstrated, changes how every previous assumption is evaluated. Now people are no longer asking what they saw. They're asking what it means that it could be seen at all. And that question doesn't stay contained. It spreads through conversations, across networks, into group discussions, into private exchanges where tone is lower but implication is sharper. Because in those spaces, people aren't performing opinions, they're adjusting understanding. And understanding is what determines movement. Meanwhile, silence from the central figure in this situation continues to function like a vacuum. It pulls interpretation into itself. Some read it as restraint, others as strategy, others as something more unpredictable, calculated observation before action. But regardless of interpretation, silence always does one thing consistently: it increases pressure on everyone else. Because without clarity, people begin to prepare for multiple outcomes at once. And preparation changes behavior even before anything actually happens. That is how tension becomes structural. Not through escalation, but through anticipation layered over uncertainty. In Houston's broader hip-hop ecosystem, that uncertainty doesn't remain abstract. It translates into recalculated distance, adjusted communication, and heightened awareness of how closely connected anyone wants to appear to the situation. Because association in moments like this is never neutral. It carries weight depending on how the situation develops. And that weight is already being measured quietly across different circles. Some people are reassessing past interactions. Some are reconsidering proximity. Others are simply observing, waiting to see whether this remains symbolic or becomes something more direct. But all of them are engaging with the same underlying reality. The balance of perception has shifted. And once perception shifts, it rarely returns to its original position. What makes this moment especially significant is that it doesn't have a clean endpoint yet. There is no resolution, no closure, no defined outcome. Only a developing tension that continues to build through attention. And attention, in this environment, is not passive, it is fuel. Every replay adds weight. Every discussion adds momentum. Every analysis adds permanence. Which means even if the original moment fades, the interpretation of it will not. It will continue to exist in commentary, in speculation, in reference points for future situations involving power, access, and reputation. That is how incidents evolve into legacy markers. Not because of their size, but because of their symbolic impact. And this one has already crossed that threshold. At the core of it all is a simple but uncomfortable reality. Influence structures depend not only on control, but on belief in control. Once belief begins to shift, even slightly, the structure does not collapse immediately, but it begins to feel different from within. And that feeling is what changes behavior. People move more carefully, speak more cautiously, interpret more aggressively, because uncertainty makes every detail feel potentially significant. Now, the situation sits in that exact space, between what has already happened and what has not yet been decided, between visibility and response, between narrative and outcome. And in that space, everything remains open. That is what makes it so closely watched. Because everyone understands that the next development, no matter how small it appears on the surface, could tilt interpretation in a completely new direction. And once that happens, everything prior to it gets reevaluated through that new lens. That is how moments like this evolve beyond their original context. Not through escalation alone, but through reinterpretation layered over time. And as long as there is no definitive resolution, the story continues to grow in meaning. Not because more is happening, but because more is being read into it. So now the question is no longer what the footage showed, or who recorded it, or why it was shared. The question is what happens when interpretation becomes stronger than explanation. Because at that point, the story stops belonging to the people in it, and starts belonging to the people watching it unfold. And that is where everything stands now, unfinished, unstable, and still developing. Before we wrap this story, understand one thing clearly. This isn't just about a viral clip, a family name, or a moment on the internet. This is about power, respect, legacy, and what happens when all of that gets tested in real time. What you just watched or heard isn't entertainment in the normal sense. It's a situation that reflects how quickly narratives can shift when something private becomes public. One footage, one decision, one upload, and suddenly an entire legacy is being questioned, discussed, and dissected from every angle. Now I want you to think about this on a deeper level. In every industry, whether it's music, business, or street culture, respect has always been the foundation. But in today's world, attention moves faster than truth, and perception often becomes more powerful than reality. So the real question is, what holds more weight now? Reputation built over decades, or a single moment captured on a phone? This is where your voice matters. Because stories like this don't just live in headlines, they live in how people interpret them. Do you see this as a challenge to a legacy, or just another example of how the internet amplifies everything without context? Drop your opinion in the comments, but be real about it. No bias, no fan talk, just your honest perspective on what you think is actually happening here. Do you believe respect in this industry is still untouchable, or is the game changing right in front of us? And if you made it this far, you already understand the depth of this story. That means you're not just here for noise, you're here for breakdowns that actually make you think. So don't forget to like the video if you want more deep dive analysis like this, because it helps push these stories further. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next update on this situation could change everything again, and you don't want to miss how it unfolds. Stay locked in.